and welcome back into Up Tempo. I'm J.D. Pickell, and now we are joined by a very special guest, the authority figure on all things college football in the great state of Texas. The Techspert, Kahn Jr. of The Athletic joins us. Sam, first off, how are you doing today?
I'm great. How are you?
Man, I'm a lot better now. I'll tell you that. I'm a lot better now. I'm excited to get into this and pick your brain on the best state in college football.
Yeah, this is we care about it a little bit differently over here than just about everywhere else. So I'm excited that it's spring football wrapped up in a lot of places. I think SMU is still going, but for the most part, we're wrapping it up, and now it's time to look ahead to the media days and recruiting. That's opening back up, and then of course the season in a few months. So it's an exciting time.
And I was going to say, as I know you were probably running all over creation trying to get to these spring games and cover all that. Were you able to catch any of Baylor's? I know you saw Texas last week. Were you just on the road these last few weeks, or what's it been like for you?
Yeah, it's been a busy few weeks for me. I went to Baylor a few weeks ago, about middle of early April. Cool. Visited with Coachranda and the coordinators there and some of the other football staffers, and got to take a peek at what Baylor's doing. I went to Texas Tech the week after that, went to Lubbock for a few days and visited with that staff and got to see their spring game. Went to Austin last week and saw Texas spring game. I also went I live down in Houston, but I also went down and saw Dana Holgorsen and his staff last week. I will try to go to SMU and hopefully stop by TCU next week, even though they are wrapping up. But I got to peek a little bit at the spring game for Baylor. I got to catch a few snippets here and there, not enough to get a good grasp on all 85 scholarship guys they got, but definitely enough to see and get a feel for kind of the way the wind is blowing in Waco right now.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, it is just practice 15 for all these schools. But when it comes down to it, you mentioned it. What is the buzz right now about Baylor and as the college football landscape is concerned?
I think it's curiosity for the most part, because last year was so unconventional, and certainly it was that way for everybody, but it was particularly that way for Daveranda and his staff, because asking a staff to build a new culture and new schemes and an entirely new identity, given the restrictions that they had with no spring football and doing everything on Zoom, was extremely challenging, and especially with a first-year head coach. I think it'd be different if it was somebody who had already been a head coach, who had already established the way he does things. Daveranda was really learning on the fly. So I think the fact that last year went so off track, and I think we all know that from what they were in 2019 as an 11-win team, that was not necessarily a 2-win team last year, even though that's what the record bore out. So I think it's curiosity, because I think people want to know, okay, what is this team really? Are they closer to the 11 wins that they were in 2019, or are they closer to a team that's still rebuilding as it seemed to be last year?
And where do you see them in that process? How much improvement can the Baylor faithful expect from their Bears this fall?
I think you'll see a little bit. I would be shocked if they don't at least go to a bowl game this year. I think they should at least be in that conversation. Defensively, you've got to feel good, because they've got some returning talent that I think is exciting, and then they've added some pieces. And you also are entering the second year with your defensive coordinator, Ron Roberts. I think anytime you have continuity, that helps, so guys know what they're supposed to do and how to do it, and you can get better at that part. I think the offense is going to be a work in progress because it's all new. Last year, obviously, it was a little bit tough to watch because they were a little bit of a mess offensively, but I think with Jeff Grimes here, established a little bit of identity. I think once you figure out who the quarterback is and what the skill set that you need to build around, then we'll have a little bit clearer direction. But we know what he wants to do offensively, and we know what kind of team Baylor will be offensively. So I think that you have those two things established. I think you will see some significant improvement in year 2 for Daveranda.
It definitely feels like adjustment is sort of a word to use when you're talking about this Baylor program. How much has Daveranda adjusted to being a head coach in general? Because before Baylor, I mean, he had never done it. There were questions about, does he even really want to be a head coach? How has he adjusted when you went and visited with him?
A lot better this year than last. And, that was one thing that I found fascinating was how candid he was and how introspective he was about his challenges last season. He admitted fully that maybe he wasn't ready for this, that he didn't. I think he understood that how to do things as a head coach is way different than the way he could do things as a coordinator. As a coordinator, he could kind of lay in the background, focus on schemes, on X's and O's, and that was what his primary part of his day was and primary part of his game week. Now, as a head coach, you have a lot more responsibilities. You've got to establish a culture for your players. You have to shake hands with boosters, and obviously not as much in this last year, but having a relationship with people outside the program, being the face of a program every day. Dave was not somebody who talked to the media all the time at LSU. LSU didn't really make coordinators available very often when he was over there. That now talking to us is a regular part of the job for Dave, and it's one that he does very well, but it's something that he didn't have to do. So that's another thing that's a time suck for him in this job. So managing all that, managing how you want your team to look, the identity of it, all those were a learning experience for him last year. And I think hearing him discuss those challenges and the way he learned from them, I think you find that he has got a much tighter grasp on all that and how he needs to divide his time and how he needs to run his program in year two.
And in terms of a first year, like the circumstances you could have going into your first year, he probably had the worst outside of having a new quarterback, which he had some longevity there with Charlie Brewer, but pandemic, new offensive staff, all these things that just were working against him. When you visited with him, did he seem comfortable? Is that a word you would use to describe him right now?
Absolutely. A lot more comfortable than he would have been a year ago. And I think that's because he understands what exactly he wants in his program. Now, what he wants to look like, what he wants the offensive identity to be. That was one thing that he was candid about, was having the offensive staff hires he did last year with George Munoz and Larry Fedora, that trying to blend offensive philosophies to a certain extent turned out to go a little bit against what he wanted his team to be offensively. Jeff Grimes, with the way they're going to be a little bit more physical up front, they're going to run the ball. There's going to be some under center. I think it jives a little bit more with what he thinks his team should be. There, obviously, he's a defensive coach, so he's got that mindset, and I think he's going to want his team to have a physical run game and attack in that way. So I think coming to peace with something like that was a big step, from year one to year two. So I think that's so important for him. And I think it's important for this program. And I think as he moves forward, the more he grows and the more he understands in that, I think the better he becomes as a head coach.
Absolutely. And I'm glad you mentioned it, the spring practice and getting a staff acclimated. It's not even really fair to evaluate with 15 practices under your belt. But what is the sense that you're getting from Baylor after this spring season? I don't even want to call it a season. It's the spring practice era.
Yeah, no, I think they feel good. They feel good about where they are. They're making progress. I think, and if you watch the spring game, certainly if you're a fan, you're probably a little concerned about the way the offense looked and some of the mistakes. There's some turnovers and things of that sort. But I also think if you watch closely, especially if you watch the quarterback play, there are some signs of positive takeaways that you can have from some of the play and some of the things. I look at offensively, I see Treston Ebner, who I think is a home run threat, who I think is in an expanded role this year is going to be fantastic. You have experienced receivers like R.J. Sneed and Tyquan Thornton, who I think are super talents. And at quarterback, obviously you got to figure that out. But I thought, Gary Bohannon had some nice moments, making plays. I thought Blake Shapen made one throw on the run that I thought was really impressive. Mm-hmm. Zeno has been around, and we're talking to coaches and people in the building over the last few weeks. He, certainly maybe he had some mistakes early on in the spring game, but that was not necessarily emblematic of what his spring was. Overall, his spring, from what I've been told, was pretty solid, and that he performed really well over the course of the spring and really impressed the staff. So it's going to be an interesting battle to see how that goes. But the defense, certainly, I think you take away is that the defense is probably a step ahead of the offense at this point. And I think that, again, when you have a second-year defensive coordinator, and you have some key players returning back, you got Terrell Bernard, obviously one of the best out there, and then the acquisition of Apu Ika in the defensive interior up front, I think he's going to be a big-time playmaker for them. I think there was a big get to get him over from LSU. When you have that type of talent on defense and you're in the second year of a system, I think it's natural to expect when you're working in a new offense that the defense is going to be a little bit ahead.
Yeah, definitely here in Waco, at least, the frustrations lay 1,000% with the offense a year ago, and obviously retooled that, going to be a new man behind center. Before the spring game, it felt like it was Jacob Zeno's to lose. At least that was my best estimate, without being too close to the program or having any source to confirm that. After the spring game, it seems like everybody on Twitter is ready to give Gary Bohannon the Heisman. And it seems like the truth is probably a little farther away from that scenario. But is there anything you're getting about who potentially is going to be the guy when it comes to game one against Texas State for the Bears at quarterback?
I think it's still to be determined. What I would say is this is why coaches don't love spring games being televised and being open to the public all the time, because we do make these grand proclamations based on what we see in that 1 of 15 practices, as you mentioned earlier. I would say this, from what I understand, like I said, Zeno had a pretty good spring. And like you said, the buzz was coming in, he probably had the slight edge coming out of spring ball, at least before we saw that spring game on Saturday. But from what I was told, Gary Bohannon had a lot of great days over the course of spring. And there were definitely some times where, okay, maybe Zeno had a good day, then maybe Gary Bohannon came with a really good day the next day. And I was told that they've made it tough on the staff so far. And Shapen, of course, let's not forget him. I think the impressive thing about Shapen that I've heard is how many different arm angles he can throw from, the way he can throw on the run, some of the ability that he has. If there's one thing with Shapen that I've been told is that one thing is they want him to understand a little bit better about decision-making, and let's be smart with the football. So, that was one thing over the course of practice and scrimmages that I've heard. But overall, these three guys have definitely made it difficult on this staff, and are going to make it a challenge to pick a starter come September. And I know he's not probably going to be the guy this year, but down the road, Kyron Drones, the compliments of that guy and his physical ability, long-term, that guy is going to be a star. Anybody who saw him at Shadow Creek and state championship a couple years ago, I think, would attest that the kid's got a tremendous amount of potential. But certainly as a true freshman, you got to learn and you got to understand, you got to develop, and doing so, this offense is a little bit different than the one he was recruited for. So that you got to take that into account. But Kyron has a physical ability. Long-term, I think you got to love the upside with him.
Yeah, I mean, I think after this redshirt year, which we're assuming it will be for him, he is all of the buzz here in WIC. He's all that in a bag of chips. So we're excited for him once he gets to be the guy under center. Going back to what you said about kind of it being a three-horse race, is it still a three-horse race from what you're hearing, or is it just kind of Zeno and Bohannon?
I would probably give Zeno and Bohannon the edge. I think it's going to be one of those two once we get to September. But yeah, it'll be interesting to see. I think we're going to see it play out in August. I don't know that they would have it started declared by the time you get to August. Certainly, the summer workouts and how they do in 7-on-7s and player-led workouts, that's going to matter. That's going to have an impact, because we're talking multiple months in between now and the start of training camp. So that's important time for both of them to step up and show some leadership and kind of take the reins. So certainly there will be somebody that's got to take that first snap in the first training camp practice in August. And that will probably be based on how much progress they made over the course of the summer. But ultimately, I think those few weeks in training camp in August are going to really determine where they end up going.
Now, let's switch gears a little bit here to recruiting. That's really going to be the future. Anyone who knows college football knows that's the lifeblood of your program, is what can you do when you get these high school kids into your program. What is the perception of Baylor to these kids that are in state, of potentially coming to Baylor and making a name for themselves on the football field? Is that something that's exciting to recruits right now, even after last season?
Yeah, I think it is, because the recruits that you're recruiting now that are 16, 17, 18 years old, they're old enough to remember some of the high points. They're old enough to remember 2014 when they made a run close to the college football playoff. They're old enough to remember Robert Griffin III winning a Heisman Trophy. Those are lasting images for a recruit, if you remember that. And then, of course, the 11-3 season in 2019. So then you go to Waco and you see what they've built at McLean Stadium, and you see, you go in the coaches' offices, and I know, there's obviously plans to improve some of the facilities there, but even the coaches' offices now, I think you walk in and the recruiting lounge, it's a really nice place. I mean, they have these huge screens and everything, and it's really impressive what I think Baylor has put together over the last 10 years and the investment they made in football facilities. But Overall, I think the buzz is positive, and I think a lot of it too has to do with relationships. As I think you look at this coaching staff, Aranda is a relationship guy. You talk to him, you sit with him. He's genuine. He's introspective. He's candid. I think that matters. Jeff Grimes is a guy who's got a background in the state of Texas, from Garland. That matters. Justin Johnson, receivers or running backs coach, played at Houston. He's from around. He's got roots down here. So having those kinds of guys on your staff and that know the lay of the land, that understand where these kids are coming from, that matters a whole lot when you're putting together a recruiting class and trying to get guys to come to your place. But I think there's no doubt that because of some of the high points that Baylor has had in the last decade, that it's recent enough that there is a positive perception of Baylor football as it portends at the moment.
On the flip side of that, the transfer portal, as of about 2 weeks ago, got a whole lot more important for a guy like Daveranda and winning now. Are you hearing anything about transfers potentially targeting Baylor as their new home, or is Baylor going to be a hot spot, do you think, with what?
I mean, that's you could really say that for anybody.
Yeah.
It's really is what happens. These next few weeks and months, we're really going to see all that play out, because what happens is after spring practice is over, all these coaches, they're going to have meetings with every individual player. Here's where you are. Here's where we see you long term. And so players are going to make their decisions at that point. Okay, where am I on the depth chart? Am I going to play this year? If I'm not going to play this year, do I need to go somewhere else? And so that means if you're Baylor, does that mean you're going to lose a couple of guys? And on the flip side, we're going to look at our roster and say, okay, after 15 spring practices, how do we feel at every position group? Do we feel weak at linebacker? Do we feel weak at offensive line? Where do we need some depth? And so you go to that portal and you're going to go find some guys. And I've heard coaches use it in a pejorative manner to call the transfer portal or the current transfer market free agency. I don't necessarily look at that as a bad thing. I think it's another way to supplement your team and improve your team. So if you're Baylor and you look at your team and you say, well, I need some offensive line depth. We like the starters we have, but we really could use another one or two offensive linemen to improve that depth. There's going to be somebody in the transfer portal that you can go get that's played college football. And unlike the high school recruits that you're trying to sign that you haven't been able to see for the last year because of the dead period, you've got college video that you can evaluate and the competition level they played. So it becomes finding a fit, figuring out who's available. But there's no doubt that is going to be a regular part of the offseason, not just for Baylor, but for the entire teams across the entire country for the coming years.
Now, all of that combined, what are your expectations for Baylor this season? Don't break my heart. Just put it to me nice and easy if you can.
I think they're probably a 500 team. I think they should be in the mix to get in a bowl game, I would think. I have to look at their schedule. Let me pull up their schedule real quick. But I think they should take a step forward. I don't think they were as bad as 2-7 last year. Mm-hmm. I think that was a confluence of circumstances. I look at the talent on the roster and I don't see a team that is a 2-win team, or I guess in a non-conference situation, it'd be a 4-win team. I think this team will take a big step forward. I think defensively they'll be solid. Like we talked earlier about, Bernard and Ika right up the middle. I love how they are defensively up the middle. And I think they've got some experience on the back end. The quarterback is going to be the most fascinating part of it to figure out. But I go back to the talent around them, the skill talent they have. The biggest question I think for Baylor is how much do they have enough quality depth up front on the offensive line, and how good are they going to be up there? But I look at the schedule, I look at the non-conference schedule, and I don't see any reason why you should not go into that Iowa State game at 3-0. So you're halfway to bowl eligibility there. Certainly you're a little bit backloaded on the schedule, but I don't see any reason why they shouldn't be in the mix for a bowl game this season.
And I'm so glad you said that about the 2-7 season a year ago. There were so many things that compounded to make that much worse than what it was. If you look across the offensive depth chart, at least, you got weapons on weapons on weapons. RJ Sneed, Tyquan Thornton, like you said, Ebner is going to be a monster. They got a lot of guys that I think people haven't heard about yet that are going to make a big impact. So it's encouraging to hear that we're matching up on some of these things here, Sam. That makes me feel really good about myself and my own assessment. So I'm feeling like I'm getting a lot of confirmation here. Riffing on that, how open is the Big 12 right now? Because all I've heard is how good Iowa State is, how good Oklahoma is. I mean, is it just them two and everybody else right now?
I think there's a little bit of a drop-off from those two to the rest of the crew, absolutely. From a talent standpoint, I think Texas is close to Oklahoma, but we know what the situation is there. It's not always just about talent at Texas. There's a lot of other things that go into it, and they're breaking in a new quarterback. They're either going to have Casey Thompson or Hudson Card starting. So there's a question to answer there. But I think Oklahoma and Iowa State are your two favorites. If you're picking Big 12 championship game contenders today, those are the two teams I'd pick. I mean, Iowa State brings back virtually everybody off of what was a fantastic team last season. And, of course, Oklahoma has Spencer Rattler back, and I love the defensive line that they've got. I think Oklahoma's under Alex Grinch defensively. He's taking some huge steps. But beyond that, Texas obviously is a team that you have to keep an eye on in the mix just because of the talent level. I'm curious to see how it goes there. I don't necessarily think they're going to be the third best team, but Oklahoma State is going to be in the mix. And TCU, I look at the way the TCU finished the season last year, winning 5 of their last 6. I look at some of the offensive talent they return with Max Duggan at quarterback, who's I think is growing, and he's got to get better, but he's growing. I look at the running back room there that is loaded with a 5-star prospect like Zach Evans, who really came on late last season. I think TCU's got a chance to take a big step forward this year. And if I had to pick a dark horse outside of Oklahoma and Iowa State, I probably am looking at TCU as a team that could potentially break in there and steal one of those Big 12 title game slots. But then the rest of the conference, I think, is pretty wide open. You know, I'm intrigued by Texas Tech. You know, they've been down the last couple of years, but they bring back a ton on defense. So I'm interested to see how they look. So, you know, it's an interesting year. And certainly I think the Big 12 is definitely, even though we know Oklahoma and Iowa State are the favorites, I don't think it's necessarily a shoe-in. And I think it's definitely going to be a little bit wide open this year.
Sam, you're going to get me in trouble here talking about TCU in such a good light. That really is going to hurt our ratings, and so I'm going to wrap this up right now. But, I mean, this is kind of a curveball, and this actually has nothing to do with Baylor right now at least, but more so the dumpster fire at Kansas. I didn't tell you we were going to talk about this, so I apologize. I'm putting you on the spot here. Is there someone you like for that job right now? I'm hearing Monken. I'm hearing Fritz. As it pertains to the Big 12, that feels like that's going to be a crucial hire for the next 10 years.
Yeah, the names that have been floated around, I guess the most in the last couple of days I've seen were Jeff Monken at Army and Lance Leopold at Buffalo. Willie Fritz, you mentioned at Tulane. I think Willie would be a great fit. To me, if you're Kansas, I think you need to do something different. That, to me, is why I think Jeff Monken makes a lot of sense. If Monken were to come there and run the triple option, just like he does at Army, I think that's a good thing for Kansas, because the talent deficit that Kansas has right now means that they're not going to get better or beat other teams doing the same thing, because they don't have the talent level that the other teams in the Big 12 have. They're so far behind in that regard. So I think the way to attack it is do something a little unconventional, something that's a little bit more difficult to prepare for. And I think bringing somebody like Monken makes a lot of sense. Fritz, I think at Tulane would be a great option if they went that way. Obviously, he's got some roots in the state. And Fritz's schematically is a little bit different, not quite triple option, but he's got some different elements to his schemes offensively that, you know, that would make it a little bit unique, certainly in the Big 12. But I think all three of those guys, Leopold also, I think all three of those guys are fantastic options for Kansas. And if I think any one of those three would be a quality guy to go with, and certainly would put them in a little bit better direction than they've been the last 8 to 10 years. And
Coach Creighton at Eastern Michigan is kind of a dark horse that I've heard a little bit about, but nothing obviously that's worth making any noise or making any headlines. But I worry about the coaches that I really like, because I don't want them to go to Kansas. And
it's a hard job.
It's got to be the hardest job, if not in
Power 5, yeah,
for sure, college football. So that's, goes without saying. I'll get you out of here with this. A lot of people, I think, panicked last year, especially casual fans in Waco panicked when they saw 2 wins after a Sugar Bowl season with Coachranda. How far away is Baylor from getting back to that national stage, and is Coachranda the guy to get them there?
I think it's a few years. I think it's at least 3 years to get back into contending for a Big 12 title. I don't think they do it this year. I'll be interested to see how this year goes, and I think that informs how ready they are to take another step, in 2022. But I think it's going to take a little time. I think this, to me, is a long-term play, because Daveranda feels to me like a guy who's going to set down roots. I don't see him as a guy that is a coaching nomad, so to speak. I know obviously as an assistant he had to be, because that's just the nature of the gig. But the fit for him with this place, just from his personality and the way, the values and just what Baylor values, I think it fits. It makes sense to me. And so as long as they can move in the right direction and take positive steps, I think the administration will be patient with him. And I think long-term in 3, 4, 5 years, I think it's going to turn out to be a great hire. I think down the road, yes, I do think Dave can get him there because he knows what championship football looks like. He did it at LSU. He was part of a great program in Wisconsin. He understands. He's been in coaching for 24 years. Is all he's done since he injured his shoulder in high school and went into coaching as a college freshman. That this is what he's done and this is what he loves. And so as long as he can grow and continue to grow as a head coach and understand how to do what he needs to do and get the program moving in the right direction, schematically, there's never going to be a problem with Dave because X and O's, go sit with him, that guy at a clinic and watch him talk football. It's incredible. It's a lot of fun to watch. So he's got that part down. As long as he gets the other things down and understands and grows in that way, I think long-term, he's got really, really high potential here at Baylor. And I think this job is, we've seen it, like we said, we talked about it earlier, some of the high points they've had in the last decade, the potential is there for Baylor. I don't know that they will do it every year, but certainly there's a chance to do it every few years.
Well, hey, I really think you're right there, Sam. I think Dave is the guy for this job to get this program heading in the right direction. I think last year was really random and not a reliable sample size at all. I think a lot of people in Waco also hope you're right and would agree with you. But Sam, thanks so much for coming on here and spending some time with us and talking about everything that is Baylor football and college football in the great state of Texas.
No problem. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Again, Sam Kahn Jr. You can find his beautiful stuff at The Athletic. He writes, does podcasts, man does it all. Keep it locked right here because we'll be right back. This is Up Tempo.